Hi, this is Bill Hader.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Bill Hader.
Hello, welcome back to We Heart Hater. I am Deej Barons, who would never insult the sausage.
And I'm your Ootsy Tootsie Doper from the North Side co-host, Casey Killingsworth.
And welcome to We Heart Hater, where we're discussing Gentle and Soft, the story of the Blue Jean Committee. Before we get to that, a couple little bits of Hater news. Bill Hader's They Know is in production. There was a picture I found online where he's basically out on the street with the camera, so I think they're maybe filming some stuff already. Linda Cardellini has been confirmed to be playing his wife, or ex-wife, and the two daughters have been cast. They are played by Lorelei Olivia Moat and Lilu Lang. Now, we don't know the daughters' names, but at least we have the core family. Twitter, because I refuse to call it X, is all abuzz about last night's episode of The Boys. We are recording this on April 29th, which is the Wednesday that The Boys is on. And there's this one scene in it, it's not really spoilery so much, is we have various, like a roundtable of different celebrities. We got Seth Rogen, Christopher Mintz-Plasse, Anissa Sari, Will Forte. Everyone's talking about is a line from Will Forte. If you're not familiar with The Boys, definitely go see it. It's on Prime, but they're at the point where Homelander is trying to basically take over the world and become the next god. Forte has this line.
Look, best day of my life was when they executed Hader. Right? More offer-onlys for the Forte.
So, in The Boys universe, Bill Hader is dead. It's interesting how just one little thing from a show could explode so much. Let us get on with the one of the Blue Jean Committee. So, Casey, care to start us off?
As Dee says, this is just part one of the two-part season one finale of Documentary Now, and we will be reviewing part two separately. IMDb describes it as a documentary charting the rise and fall of soft rock seminal band, the Blue Jean Committee. The main source material for this episode is the 3-hour History of the Eagles documentary. They do incorporate some elements of the actual histories from other mid-70s soft rock bands of this ilk, like America, Chicago, and Steely Dan, peaceful and easy-feeling dad rock from 50 years ago. So Deej said about the Drones episode, it's a Weird Al-type style parody of one very specific genre of documentaries rather than just one specific documentary.
Also known as yacht rock.
Oh, I thought this would have been a few years before yacht rock.
Yacht rock, roughly spanning the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, approximately 1976 to 1984, finds a polished and sophisticated sub-rock genre characterized by high-quality production, jazz-influenced harmonies, and smooth R&B grooves. Centered in Los Angeles, this is the West Coast sound.
So it's a parody of just the whole genre of yacht rock, using the history of the Eagles as the framework. And naming this, the Blue Jean Committee, was previously used by Bill and Fred, more so Fred, in a previous SNL sketch, November 19th, 2011 episode with host Jason Segel and musical guest Florence and the Machine. Fred and Jason Segel were in a band called the Blue Jean Committee.
Just a few notes that I found online and from a 92Y panel describing the inspirations for this episode. This is from a Rolling Stone article on September 24th, 2015. According to Hader, they happened to come across an episode of Classic Albums, which is a VH1 show, focused on Steely Dan's Aja, and started to develop the soft rock idea in the form of a fake track-by-track doc. It was just going to be about the making of California Breeze, he says. And then we thought, wait, what if these guys were guys were originally a tough guy Chicago band that decided that they wanted to be a mellow California band instead. Once we figured that out, everything took off from there. In this article, they described the song Catalina Breeze as a single greatest Steely Dan parody. Bill said, I had to learn the bass parts to those songs, and I must have heard California Breeze 50 times or so while we were filming the performance scene. And it wasn't until I watched the final episodes that I realized just how batshit those lyrics are. A barstool intellectual with a master's degree in small talk and going to the movies. Where the hell do they come up with that? Now, that is from the mind of Fred Armisen. All the music in this episode was written by Fred Armisen and John Spurney. This album is available on Spotify, and you can actually buy a physical vinyl LP.
Doesn't surprise me that Fred Armisen wrote the music and lyrics to this. They do seem to have a little too much of that Armisen pretentiousness to them for my tastes, and just the name Blue Jean Committee. I mean, to me, that sounds more like a struggling local battle of bands type band than a California band that made it big. So to me, that part just feels like Armisen wanting to reuse an old idea of his, even if it doesn't totally work or doesn't totally gel that well with this concept, but it doesn't, really distract me that much from the rest of this. But I just had to get that off my chest before we started. Bill plays Clark Honus. Fred plays Gene Allen, the co-founders of the band. John Spurney plays himself as the keyboardist. And we open with Helen Mirren telling us that
some rock bands endure for decades, others are gone in an instant. But every so often, that instant creates music that lasts forever. Please enjoy tonight's film, Gentle and Soft, the story of the Blue Jean Committee.
And then the film opens like a typical rock documentary with LA concert footage circa 1974, interspersed with like present day interview footage from Daryl Hall from Hall & Oates, Cameron Crowe, Rolling Stone writer, director of Almost Famous, which is another thing I think this borrows a bit heavily from, Chuck Klosterman, author and pop culture critic, Kenny Loggins, and all the members of the band Haim, hyping up this band, speaking highly of their greatness, as most music documentaries do. Cameron Crowe speaks to what significant events the Blue Jean Committee's concerts were in their fans' lives and how they measure their time and their life events by those concerts. Chuck Klosterman compares Catalina Breeze, the album, to Fleetwood Mac's Rumors in terms of popularity and sheer volume of singles that came from that in a 2-year period. Kenny Loggins, he has some funny quotes in this. He calls it the quintessential California record and tells us that it expertly captured something that neither he nor any other musician of his ilk felt that they were able to capture at the time. Klosterman speaks to how the placid and tranquil sonic quality of their music was in direct conflict with how bombastic and aggressive the band's relationship was in real life. And we see footage of Gene and Clark just angrily shoving each other on stage during one of their most infamous stage shows. Haim speaks to how they can still listen to the Blue Jean Committee's music today and still feel the love the band once had for each other at one time, and how they feel the same love for each other as sisters and as bandmates. We see the title card feels a little out of pace with something made in the 2000s, but it begins with Honus Video presents in association with Clark Tone. Next, we just see footage of present-day Gene Allen, played by Fred Armisen, working a typical, normal labor shift at a sausage packing plant in Chicago. Bill and Fred do both lean into their fake Chicago accents pretty hard in this.
Well, I wouldn't call Bill's entirely fake because his father's originally from Chicago, and his father has 7 brothers. So he's used to the accent from the Chicago side of his family. I do believe that Bill comes by his Chicago accent, honestly.
And then Gene presents himself as very humbled by all the success he's achieved in the music business and all the kind words people have written about him. And then he says, it's a glamorous job. You do it for the love of it. And as he says this, we see footage of him doing a temperature check on some sausage, and he says, perfect. And it's unclear whether he when he said that, was he talking about the music or his current meatpacking job? And then Gene says that he's not mad at Clark. He hasn't even thought about him in years.
We then cut to manual labor watering the massive garden of a massive ocean view beach mansion where Clark lives in Malibu. We first see Clark skimming his own pool before he tells us how he got this mansion in 1998 with his own money.
Bought all these guys out. I'm trying to buy that guy out. Because see how his telephone pole is obstructing my view of the ocean? If you're sitting here, I can't see the ocean from here. So I got to knock all that out.
In the background, you hear like seagulls and waves and other ocean noises. He says that fame is nice and it was all worth it. When he looks at everything he has and what he has acquired with his own money, he says to himself,
When I look at what I've got, I say, thank God I thought up this Blue Jean Committee thing.
And then we fade to Kenny Loggins describing the Blue Jean Committee from the first time he heard them in his car driving down the PCH. His description of their music is, it sounded like nothing he had ever heard before and everything about California all at the same time, and that they somehow describe everything we've all been after. And it makes him wonder, where the heck did this music come from? Then we cut to an establishing shot, Chicago 4 decades earlier. You see Clark telling us he's Chicago born and bred, intercut with old 50s, 60s home movie footage of him at 5 years old. And from this point forward, all the interviews with Gene take place in a random Chicago bar with him wearing a leather jacket with short gray hair. And all the interviews with Clark take place in his mansion living room with his short, less noticeably gray hair, with him wearing an outfit that I can only describe as an all-white, ethereal, cult leader-like beach outfit. Just very flowing shirt, flowing pants, all white. Deej, how would you describe it?
basically just sort of casual linen, probably because California can get pretty warm, although being on the ocean, you have a lot of winds in Malibu. I like that they use actual yearbook photos of both Bill and Fred. They did the same thing in the Skeleton Twins, where they had Kristen Wiig's yearbook photo and Bill's yearbook photo. It's very comfortable, casual linen. Clark has said, people have always said I was a bit of a handful, which is probably a nice way of saying I was a little dickhead. Clark says his dad was a foreman at the Vienna Beef Factory down on North Damon. Gene says both his parents worked at Swanky Sausage and Rendering Plants, which is where they met. Mom did quality control and Dad worked as a packer, and he would play with the hairnets and bring them back home, but he liked playing the music the most. Intercut with footage of Gene as a 6-year-old.
And then we cut to present-day Gene at the bar saying he was a fan of old doo-wop groups, so not just oldies, but ancienties. And he says he met Clark. They both went to St. Melarova's Sausage School. They only knew each other from the hallways. And then they show us their yearbook photos, which, yeah, you can tell that's Bill's actual high school yearbook photo, but Fred's photo looks like it could have been him at any age. Just, it could have been him on SNL. It could have been a yearbook photo. Just he's looked kind of the same all throughout time, if you ask me.
And Clark was on the school wrestling team, and Gene played music. And Clark had noticed that the guys with guitar.
I started noticing that the guys with the guitars were getting more chicks than the guys in the team, which, I didn't like.
And he says he can't point out one specific moment when he and Gene formed the band, because to him, it happened very organically. Clark, throughout this whole, you can tell he's like very, very alpha and aggressive. So Gene says,
So one day, Clark finally comes up to me, first time he'd said anything to me, and he says, hey, you're in my group now.
Gene asks if he could go down to the hall, which Clark replied, no, you're in my group as of right now. At which point, Gene and Clark dropped out of sausage school to play music. Zoom in on a very early 60s style poster for early Gene and Clark gig.
So then we hear from Gene's sister, Patty Skrowakeski, played by Paula Pell, famed former SNL writer. Patty says their mom and dad didn't like that their little Eugene Skrowakeski was playing these ootsy-tootsy songs to a bunch of dopers on the north side under the new name Gene Allen. She and her gal pals thought it was pretty cool, especially her friend Doreen, who either blew him or gave him some kind of tug job. And that's where Act 1 ends. Act 2 begins as Daryl Hall tells us Gene and Clark didn't have a brand new sound, but rather one that was very much of its time, so he thought that they might have a future. Another establishing shot of Chicago circa 1967. Gene tells us he and Clark were starting to just play open mics, diners, pizza places, any local gig they could get. Clark says they need to find a recording studio, and there weren't a lot in Chicago. So he managed to book them some time at Capstone Studios on the north side. Here we meet sound mixer Mitch DeGonda, played by W. Earl Brown, and recording mixer Gordo, played by Jeff Doucette. We see them for the first time, and they spend most of this episode just arguing intensely with each other about just specific locations in Chicago and where things were and where they are. So that's good for a few laughs here and there. Here we learn the origin of the band name. Gene says they just seen the movie Easy Rider and decided to wear some blue jeans they got from Marshall Fields to copy that film's look so they could be seen as just some regular guys with some style.
Clark says they got what's known as a Canadian tuxedo, and yes, that is an actual thing, and walked into their first Capstone Studio session where Gordo jokingly asks, "Who sent you, the Blue Jean Committee?" causing Clark to go kabap, as he puts it, which basically he just punches Gordo in the mouth. Gordo says that he flattened his nose, gave him a concussion and nerve damage, sent him to the hospital.
The funny thing is, a couple days later, Clark comes into the same exact room and he says, you know what we should call ourselves? The Blue Jean Committee.
He had a point. I mean, what can I say? I mean, when you're right, you know.
Clark said Gene had a vision for the album that transported people back to Chicago, and Gene says he wanted Blue Jean Committee to be a good Chicago blues band that would make listeners feel and smell Chicago. We didn't cut the footage of Gene and Clark happily strumming along in the studio in a clip captioned Chicago Blues Sessions, Capstone Studios, 1971. And they are wearing jeans, but rather than denim shirts, Gene is wearing a green plaid button-up, and Clark is wearing a red hoodie. Gene is singing Chicago, whoa, 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 over and over again.
Chicago, whoa, 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 Chicago, whoa, 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 Chicago, whoa, 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 Chicago, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Clark says they cranked out 2 albums, lickety split. Their debut, St. Santalos Matinee, contained the single Hey Miss, and this is an example of the wonderful lyrics by Fred.
Hey miss, can I get a beer and then a couple of beers? Hey miss.
Yeah, I love how they even take some swings at like that bastardized, old graying white guy version of Chicago blues here. That's pretty funny. Then Gene says in February 1972, the band put out their second album, which they called 221 Pulaski Parkway. I just love they're just naming their albums after specific Chicago locations. And for the second album, they come up with the songs Wind Off the Lake, Wolves at My Door, Goodbye Dan Ryan, Steamin' and Lip Service, which was just a song about mustaches. We hear bits of Steamin' and Lip Service.
Clark says the album tanked big time. Gene says the hard part was that they financed it themselves. Clark says that they were out of cash and up to their eyeballs in remaindered LPs, which Gene says hit Clark pretty hard. Clark and the 2 studio guys say he holed himself up in his apartment where he went into a dark place drinking, drugging, and paying for sex. And Clark says he was walking out of Betty's with a 12-year-old old style when he saw the most beautiful sight of 2 seagulls, which made him think of the ocean, sand, and beach balls, which made him feel good about himself for the first time in months. Clark then later admits,
It wasn't until I sobered up that I realized that the birds were pigeons, but who gives a shit? I mean, it's a better story with seagulls.
Gene says that Clark called up and they said they were to have a meeting. Gene says Clark said, fuck Chicago, to which Gene was prepared to fight him because no one says that. Clark then said, California. We're going to be a California band.
California was the vibe, you know, feeling the breeze and the air and the sun on your skin, you know, that kind of shit, you know. Write music about that. It's not that hard.
And that gives us the end of Act 2.
Act 3 begins with Chuck Klosterman creating an interesting analogy between the Beach Boys having written all these songs about surfing, but never having surfed themselves in real life, and the Blue Jean Committee having written all these songs about California while living in Chicago and not having been to California at the time they were writing these songs. Gene questions this move, saying that he only knows, being from Chicago, he only knows from beer and blues and not knowing what to write about with California, so he imagines it would entail just writing about hills and grapes and wine. Clark says, fact of the matter is no one gave a shit about Chicago because they weren't making money. All the money was in California. Gene said Clark insisted on writing the songs if he had to.
Cut to a shot of Clark at a handwritten song list with number 1 being Sand Song, number 2, Seagull Song, number 3, Beach Balls with a question mark, number 4, another sand one. So as you can see, he was not exactly the best inspiration for doing songwriting. Gene says that they had nothing and were stuck in Chicago with no songs, no album, and no plan, but they're fortunate enough to meet famed music producer Alvin Itzoff, which was played by Irving Azoff, who was the actual manager for the Eagles for a while. And he's also a concert film producer. We're introduced to Alvin Itzoff through old footage and photos of him giving the finger to the camera nonstop as Gene and Clark talk up his reputation as the biggest music producer of all time. Daryl Hall calls him a world-class asshole. Gene says Clark got a tip from a friend who worked at O'Hare International Airport that Itzoff was flying into Chicago to sign Peter Cetera. So Clark decided that they should camp out and wait at Terminal 3. Alvin says he saw the door to his little fling open and this lunatic hops in waving a cassette tape.
He was scared shitless. He's a little guy. He said, "Who are you?" And I go, "I'm your next star. Shut up. Listen to the tape." I had my forearm on his neck like that.
Gets in my face and says, "Teach me how to be a California pansy."
Once again, Clark being very aggro, which is one thing that Bill has commented on in a couple of panels and interviews where you got these big, tough Chicago guys, but playing like what he describes as the most pussy music. And then he played another thing with a sample of them doing harmonies to the word kielbasa. Nod to their sausagey roots. He admitted they could sing, and Clark says he could see dollar signs in Alvin's eyes.
And then Alvin says his big thing was reinventing a band's image. He cites the band Shreveport. It says, "I remember them. I massively changed their image." And we see 2 different album covers, one with a group of early Beach Boys folksmen-like white men in dorky button-down red striped sweaters, short sleeves. One of them's holding a banjo, and the cover of the album is titled Brothers in Folk, followed by a seemingly entirely different group of people, because the second group is 4 black men in Parliament Funkadelic Sly and the Family Stone type outfit on an album cover titled Brothers in Funk. And Alvin and Gene tell us that Alvin was apparently unable to educate them on how to be a California band because, again, they've never been there. And we see a photo of Alvin just showing the band a map of California as they look on in sheer confusion. Then Alvin says he just gave up 6 hours later and said, "Fuck it, let's just fix the wardrobe," followed by a photo shoot of the BJC members in hipper clothing, which is later used in an article where the photo has a caption, "Local blues band goes California, then turns their back on Chicago." And then both Gene and Clark state with utter contempt and disgust that the rumor going around Chicago that they had gone vegetarian was not true. Clark says that's a death sentence in Chicago, and the studio guys say, "You can get away with insulting a lot of things in this city. We're a liberal town, but don't insult the sausage."
Yes, the sausage is very, very, very sacred. Then Clark says this rumor caused his cousins to firebomb his apartment and almost killing him, and As he says, this girl he was banging at the time. Gene says it was the first time in his life he ever wanted to get out of Chicago. They had to hold himself up in the studio, which was the only place that would be safe, which was a blessing in disguise because it gave Gene the idea to come up the California breeze in that little dweeb mind of him, as Clark describes. Haim says his album was so incredible that every song on it became a single. We see footage of the Catalina sessions, where Gene says he allowed his deep love of music to figure out what the California sound was by breaking it down to find the right harmonies and lyrics. Alva Itzoff and keyboardist John Spurney both say they recorded the album in 1 to 3 nights at Gene's direction, which exhausted the band. We hear Walking Shoes and Mr. Fix and other titles the interview subjects list off that made their careers. Clark needed to find that one quality that would separate him from the rest of the band, and the rest of the band from everyone else in music at the time. And he apparently had an ability to sing at an extremely high falsetto that he described.
Falsetto is a very phallic form of singing. It's very manly. It's very, got a lot of confidence, got a lot of strength.
While he did play bass in all the music, the singing is done by Petra Hayden. And that brings us to the end of Act 3.
Act 4 begins with Kenny Loggins describing Catalina Breeze as the perfect album for our times. It summed up all our lives, and he and Daryl Hall each call the album and title track one for the ages. And then we see a live performance on the NBC show In Concert, circa spring of 1970, performing that album's title track, Catalina Breeze, cut with live in concert as a crowd chants, BJC, BJC. And then we see that typical cliched montage of the song being played, rising to the top of the charts, followed by shots of Gene Clark on the covers of Time, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, Tiger Beat, as well as being profiled in Playboy. Chuck Klosterman says it's inevitable that this relationship would self-combust when one guy in the band does everything and another guy just sings high. We see the credits of Part 1 roll over more footage of Catalina Breeze being performed. And how does that relationship self-combust? Well, you'll have to listen to the episode after our next one to find out. Just my overall take on this episode, aside from what I see as like the lack of cohesion between Armison's ideas and the themes and subject matter, what does make it work here for me is the backstory and the characterizations. It's more about Bill and Fred creating characters and sinking into or disappearing into them. And yeah, as Deej said, he does seem like a very aggressive, aggro, alpha male, but Bill's character Clark seems fairly capable of concealing his open sociopathy and is just cartoonishly ruthless in getting what he wants. He seems like he's singularly obsessed with status seeking and trend chasing, which I guess was common at this time. And though he is a performer, we do see Clark is mainly in the music business for the business side of it. He's very domineering, intimidating, and just works his own singular obsession with his own masculinity into his music, lashing out hard at anyone who dares question his manhood, sometimes preemptively. And I think Clark may have been based on Don Henley, partially, because we know the Eagles were a bit of an inspiration for this, and some not so great things come out about Don Henley. Fred's character, Gene Allen, is much more talented creatively and just wants to express his clear love of music more than anything, but he has very strong convictions that he stand by, which Clark doesn't seem to. Neither of them forget their roots, but Gene's always more in touch with his and Clark, but they still have a very symbiotic relationship. And the style here is definitely tell, don't show, which works in its favor, because the backstory of this band's rise to fame and power is just littered with low-key, absurd, and cartoonish details that are contained and kept in check by being told in the style of just your typical rock and roll famous album documentary, and that's just much funnier being told to you than outright shown.
Winter talked about this episode in a 92Y panel just before the start of season 2, and Bill had said one of his favorite observations about the Eagles.
Oh, yeah. When Don Henley, when he's on good terms with people, he's like, well, Don, which means Don Felder, David, which means David Geffen. But when he's suing them, they become Mr. Geffen and Mr. Felder. It's like, well, Mr. Felder and Mr. Geffen didn't find fit to fly. You're like, this guy, wow. I'm just imagining those guys at home watching, like, dude, that was so long ago.
Yeah.
Relax. Well, Mr. Geffen did not.
Do like how these guys very much fall into these parts because they're very believable as the guys that they are. In particular, Hader, who we heart, as we say. There is a certain sadness to Clark. He has a beautiful home and a beautiful place where he just wants to buy someone's place to knock it out so he can get a better view. And we'll see more of this in the second part of this, where he has all this money and all this, but is he really fulfilled? Where Clark is just back at home once again making sausage, but still entertained down at the local bar. This then is describing their old dynamic and where things go into the second part. So there's a lot of funny things in this with a lot of the song lyrics and just some of the ways that Clark acts. The real parts of comedy is not necessarily playing it, trying to be wacky, but playing it straight, which can lend to the funny, but also it is essentially a comedy series. It doesn't always have to be completely ha-ha funny comedy. Sandy Passage, where little Vivi was very bitter about the things that Big Vivi had done in keeping men away from her, and there are some good, honest, emotional moments. So this is billed as one of the best episodes of documentary now, and I definitely do believe that. But wait till we get to part 2.
Okay, and that concludes this episode of We Heart Hater. And next week, SNL Season 33, Episode 6 of that season with host Elliot Page and musical guest Wilco.
But for now, I am Deej Behrens and will continue to be.
And I will still be Casey Killingsworth until I'm told otherwise.
Although in the boys' universe, Bill may be dead, at least in our real universe, he's still alive, and we heart Hater.
We heart Hater. It's what we do.
Thank you for listening to We Heart Hater. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. We Heart Hater is a presentation of Wacky Notion Productions. Created by Deej Behrens. Hosted by Deej Behrens and Casey Killingsworth. Recording and editing by Deej Behrens. Intro and outro music by Music Unlimited, used under Creative Commons license, courtesy of Pixabay.com.